guest this episode is Timothy D. Taylor, who is the author of the fantastic and thought-provoking Making Value, Music, Capital, and the Social, which is out now on Duke University Press. Tim, thank you so much for being on Money for Nothing. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
So I thought this book was so interesting. I've been a fan of your work for a long time. Listeners of the show know I do a lot of research on kind of the early days of the music industry in like the late 19th, early 20th century. And so your work has kind of moved in and around the whole history of commodified music. But I think not quite with this amount of kind of like focus, theoretical focus, maybe, as this most recent book has. And I think it's a really, really interesting, I think like it opened up a lot of areas for me and I think can really help push this like really needed conversation about how music and capitalism interact. Certainly for listeners of the show, that's our whole thing. So it shed a new light on a lot of different issues, and just it was great to read someone kind of thinking about this in like a pretty fundamental way. And so maybe to start with, like what led you to this book or this project?
I don't know if I could name any particular thing. It was, just getting more and more deep into various theories and becoming increasingly dissatisfied by the way we tend to talk about, popular music as a commodity, or this kind of music isn't a commodity. And it's clear to me, thanks to Arjun Appadurai's introduction to his book called The Social Life of Things, that goods, even musical goods, have careers. Something can be a gift, start off as a gift and end up as a commodity, and then become a gift again, and on and on and on. And we didn't have a very good way of talking about that. And more ethnographically, I mean, I know a lot of musicians who are dying to commodify their music and aren't able to. They're not, they're not able to make a living in music. So how do we talk about, the value of music or anything if it's not a commodity, or if it's only a commodity for a short time, or if it's continually changing roles? And a friend of mine recommended Fred Meyer's, who's an anthropologist at NYU, recommended Fred Meyer's introduction to the social life of, the empire of things, which I read, and that really got me into anthropological value theory, which I was predisposed towards anyways, because my wife's an anthropologist and not a value theory person, but she's an anthropologist, so I've been on a sort of perpetual postdoc in anthropology the last 30 some odd years. Because in the music fields in which I was trained, we're not given much theory, if any. So I'm pretty much an autodidact when it comes to theory. But, I've managed to sort of give myself, and with my wife's help, sort of a theory basics sort of education over the years. And so anthropological value theory just worked for me because it gave me a way to talk about how value is produced, even if we're not talking about commodities, or to understand a commodity is only one sort of situation that a good can be in. It can be another sort of situation in another context. And it can be very quick. I mean, these contexts can change very quickly. I mean, I can go to Whole Foods. This is not an advertisement. I could go to a fancy grocery store and buy lots of nice ingredients and come home and make a nice dinner for my wife, which is, so I'm buying commodified foodstuffs, but I'm making, a gift in the form of a nice dinner. And it just seemed to me that the anthropologists who are working on value have a much better way of talking about, the careers that goods can take. And usually in that theory, it's tend to be polarized between talking about commodities and talking about gifts, thanks to Marcel Mauss's famous book, Essay on the Gift, or just the Gift. But people like Fred Myers and Anat Singh and Arjun Appadurai, Jane Geyer, many anthropologists have been trying to, and David Graeber is maybe especially, they've been trying to get rid of this binary and try to get us to understand, the flux and flow of conceptions of value and the flux and flow of goods, whether or not they're commodities. So I just found that literature to be super useful. and very teachable too for fellow academics out there. There's not so much of it that you can't actually cover the highlights in one graduate seminar.
So just for listeners who might be, I think, a little bit less, so like our listeners, they know Marx, they know commodities, and I think some of these thinkers and this other tradition is maybe a little bit less familiar to folks. So I thought maybe it'd be useful if you could say a little bit about, you've already said a little bit about, but like why, what like the standard take on the commodification of music is, and then why someone like Mauss helps us think around that.
Well, there wasn't much of a standard take because we're so atheoretical in the music field. So that's changing slowly. But really, the only person who really dealt with it in any length was Adorno, and Adorno just assumed that all popular music was a commodity and all the same. So it was a standardized, mass-produced object like a toaster oven or something. And he thought that classical music, through sort of bad kinds of teaching and commercialization, was becoming a commodity, and that the use value of classical music, which was social critique, was being eclipsed by its value as a social marker of distinction, which of course we know a lot about from Bourdieu, but Adorno dismissed that as any sort of real value. So he just thought that exchange value was becoming, all that there was even in classical music, and that popular music was, worthless. And most people pretty much accepted that, I think, in and out of the music fields. And when I wrote, the first thing that I really wrote that I tried to dig into with respect to the idea of music as a commodity was about player pianos in the late 19th century. And I thought, because I'm enough of a wannabe anthropologist that I don't like, writing theory for theory's sake, or what do you call theoreticist theory? I think theory has to have an object, whether it's ethnographic or historical. Um, but at first I thought I'm going to write the article that really defines what music as a commodity is. That I realized, not only did I need a case, but that I also realized that it's actually a really complex question. More complex than Adorno allowed for, I think, since he just was dismissive of all popular music, and he wasn't an ethnographer. Um, and writing that article helped me really sort of think through some of these issues. And that came out in 15 years ago or so. And that really helped me think about some of those issues. The way that Mose has helped is because I think most people just think that essay on the gift is just about, the importance of gift giving and receiving, and we can't ignore that. But I think he was saying something more profound and it's useful to us today. And I owe Keith Hart and David Graeber for some of what I'm about to say. But uh, most wanted us to understand that even in the world, in the 1920s when he was writing this short book, even in that world, uh, which was dominated by capitalism, there's all kinds of gifts exchange that goes on all the time. And we can't let capitalism blind us to all of these kinds of gift exchanges. From, like your friend saying, oh, no, I'll buy that cup of coffee today. You can pick up the next one. Or I'll give you a lift home from school. Or, I mean, this kind of stuff goes all the time. And in many cases, it actually matters for the establishment and or continuation of music scenes. I mean, I did an ethnographic study of the indie rock scene in Echo Park, Los Angeles, which is an east side of town neighborhood. And musicians routinely told me that if they got paid, they were lucky to get 35 or $40. So clearly that scene does not depend on money.
Yeah.
It depends on all other kinds of ways of the production and exchange of value. So one guy, for example, I'll give him the plug. His band is called Criminal Hygiene. And the guy I interviewed, his name is Michael Fiore. So Michael was telling me about when his band went on tour, and he'd already told me that by day, he drove a pizza delivery truck, just to make ends meet. So I said, well, how can you go on tour for weeks and, quit your day job? He said, oh, the owner of the pizza place is very supportive of the indie rock scene. So, in what I wrote, I characterized that as a kind of patronage, which we're used to talking about in the classical music world. There used to be a record store in Echo Park that would have, when a band would release a new recording, they would let the band have a show in the shop, no charge. And musicians helped out each other all the time. So, this scene depends on all kinds of ways of producing value and exchanging value that don't really have much to do with money. To the extent that a music manager, a manager of a band, told me he had a band that was really starting to take off. This is in the Making Value book, this discussion, but he had a band that's starting to take off. And one night, after lots and lots of shows where they didn't make much money, after one show, they made a few $1,000s. And one of the band members said to their manager, the guy interviewed, they said, "What do we do with this money?" Because, they're just not used to making money and they don't know what to do with it. So, for me to talk about, music as a commodity or whatever, I mean, it's actually, it's really, really hard to make a living in music, to
Yeah,
successfully commodify your music.
famously. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think we get fooled into thinking that, well, either there's the Taylor Swifts of the world, or there's the people who struggle who never make it. But there's all kinds of people in between, and we don't pay attention very much to career arcs. Like what happens to the guy who plays, or the band who plays Friday nights in the Holiday Inn, and then they sign with a major label and they have a decade of success. But then after 20, 30 years, they're back playing in the Holiday Inn on Friday nights. But we don't really study that kind of thing, which
I
interests me
mean,
a lot.
cheap trick, still on tour.
Yeah.
No, that's really that makes a lot of sense, and I think that that focus on thinking about the ways in which music functions in non-commodified ways, and the really important ways and socially constitutive ways that music functions in ways that are not directly commodified or not completely related to capitalism. But I think that one of the things that this book does that's really interesting is that I think that a lot of discourse,
Yeah.
we can take indie scenes as an example, is kind of arguing that these are, whether it's folk music that is somehow outside, perceived as being outside the realm of capitalism, or scenes that are seen as being kind of like countercultural scenes in which they are directly somehow being organized around visions of authenticity or expression that are somehow directly opposed to overarching structures of capital extraction. I mean, what I think your book does in a lot of really interesting ways is sort of trouble that trouble that perhaps overly utopian assumption, and kind of think about the ways in which if if a vision of a world where we go from things not being commodified to things being commodified in this kind of unitary directional flow isn't actually a good picture of how capitalism works, that what the role that these non-commodified spaces play within the overarching structures of capitalism is a lot more complicated and maybe not as oppositional as
Yeah.
some folks would like.
No, I think, it's easy to forget and talk about capitalism as though it's an agent, but it's not an agent. People are agents. And capitalism is a social form. It's not some kind of vague economic system out there that imposes itself on us. It's a structure, to use that kind of language. And structures are made by people as they simultaneously act on people, and some people are trying to get rid of them. And structures, I mean, this is the sort of practice theory dynamic that still I find useful. But it's easy to forget that there's real people. That's why I wrote that chapter on music managers in the value book, because we need to pay attention. It's not like, all of a sudden this kind of music just takes off. And it's like, well, wait a minute. There's some guy or woman who figured out I can make money off of that. Still, whether or not it's hip hop or, whatever. Um, and sometimes they can make money that establishes a new genre, and sometimes not. But I think we need to pay a lot more attention to, those people who are the entrepreneurs or the agents, the managers, the record producers, the ones who are figuring out how to turn what might be a marginal or local music into something that's going to be more easily commodified. And we don't have a lot of studies about that. I mean, I wrote the one that I wrote, the chapter in the Making Value book, but I think we need to pay a lot more attention to this, because it's too easy to think of capitalism as just coming in and eclipsing everything else. And that's kind of true.
But it's more varied and more texture. I mean, this is oh gosh, she wrote the book about the Matsutake mushrooms, Anna Tsing, right? With this idea that capitalism is really variegated and that there are people that commodities kind of move from chain to chain. It's this wonderful book. Listeners, check it out. The Mushroom at the End of the World. It's you will not believe how much you care about these mushrooms and how they get from place to place. It's a mind bender. But this idea kind of that there are these kind of, you call them, I think in the book, commodity chain capitalism, this idea that things kind of move from place to place to place, and in doing so actually do accrete different kinds of value. But in order for that to work, capitalism can't be one unitary thing. It has to be different in different
Yeah.
places.
Yeah, and it depends on agents who are going to figure out. I mean, when I was in grad school, I spent a year living in Ireland, and I learned to play Irish traditional music. And I still play every Sunday night in a bar in Long Beach. And that's not a music that's going to make money for most people. But Riverdance, this Irish dance spectacular, I mean, Michael Flatley and other people they figured out how to commodify that music, at least, or that music and dance, at least for a while. I don't think it's playing anymore on Broadway, but it takes an agent, an entrepreneur, somebody who can imagine what it takes to commodify something that's previously been uncommodified.
I mean, it also made me think in a different way about, again, if we think about the kind of like commodity biographies, especially in recorded music, um, about the ways in which things move in and out of commodity status. Almost, I was thinking about this in relationship to almost like gentrification, right? Like one theory about gentrification is that overarching structures value a place, people go there to do that, they devalue other places, and then the whole thing reverses, right? It goes back and forth and back and forth, and every time you create a difference and devalue something, you can then later value it. And so it made me think a little bit about like reissue labels, right? Where it's these, records, whether it's like soul, like vintage soul or like vintage dub reggae, where it was a commodity and then it was decommodified because, I don't know, the slang tang rhythm came in and like dance hall went digital. And then precisely because of the fact that it is decommodified, it is able to become a collector's
Yeah.
rarity and recommodify or be reissued as a lost Dennis Bovell classic or whatever.
Yeah, and I think we're getting more studies of that kind of movement, but I still think that there's a tendency to think about the question of commodification in a binary way.
So what one question I had about this part of the book, and I wasn't quite clear on, was how constitutive you think that kind of movement is. And by that I mean it seems like you could draw two pictures. One is that there's a mainstream and that's what everyone's focusing on. And you can think about it either in the kind of like somewhat conspiratorial capitalism, uppercase C, or a music industry full of a bunch of people trying to make a buck, and that they're focusing on one thing, and they're throwing off little bits and pieces, and then someone else later can like come along, pick up a piece, and do something with it. Or do you think that it's, when I say constitutive, I mean that the kind of trends of cycles of valuation of things being commodified and decommodified and recommodified is actually like an important, a central driving engine of how the commodification of culture, at least the commodification of culture in contemporary, 20th and 21st century America
Well, what
functions.
I like about value theory is that, you know, everybody has conceptions of what they value. And sometimes those are economic conceptions and sometimes they're not. And what we learned from David Harvey and
Mm-hmm.
Anna Singh and others is that, when capitalism comes to town, or maybe I should say capitalist to be consistent, it tends to discipline, in David Harvey's term, all other forms of the production of value. But this is a constant process. It's ongoing all the time.
Right.
And I think value theory has made me a better ethnographer. I'm an archival historian too. It's made me a better ethnographer because I'm trying to think about, what is it that the people I'm talking to, what is it that they value? But these things can be transitory. and you have to keep your eye on, especially if you're doing a longer study, you have to keep an eye on how transitory they are. I think
Hmm.
people's actions both create and reveal what they value.
Right.
And those things can be constantly in flux. Well, they are constantly in flux, but sometimes, values that people hold personally can last a long time and sometimes not. To answer your question more directly, I mean, we have to I mean, since capitalism is a social form,
Hmm.
we have to see it as constantly in motion, and it's constantly in motion around conceptions of value, some of which are economic forms and some of which aren't, and some of which the economic forms are the ones that motivate, the producers or the agents or the music managers who say, I could figure out how to make money off of that. But at the same time, especially in the indie world, there's what you call the economic world reversed, people who value being out of the mainstream, and they're not trying to be. I mean, my Echo Park study, I didn't find a single person who said I want to be a rock star or anything. The most ambitious thing anybody ever said was, and a lot of people said this, I just want to be able to make a living at
So I mean,
music.
that was really interesting, that part, because a I like was around Echo Park sometimes in that period of time, and I like it's funny that it's a capsule in time that like young musicians now are not like they can't afford rent there, but also
Yes, speaking of
yeah,
gentrification,
yeah. But I mean, also when I say it's a moment in time, is I do also think that it's I mean, partially it's because of I wonder to what extent their relationship, the this kind of lackadaisical is maybe a misnomer, but not totally off base. Their lackadaisical relationship to money that this group of bands and this group of performers you interviewed had, like to what extent that's about the kind of decommodification of rock music that had occurred in the early to mid 2000s. Just it reminded thinking a little bit about like bands in the 80s underground, the kind of like our band could be your life era, Fugazi, REM, Black Flag, where all of these people are very much not very much opposed to mainstream values of how rock music should function socially and culturally and in relation as an economy, but also are very focused on dollars and cents issues, right? Like Fugazi is like run and Black Flag are running businesses that are intended to function like in very specific ways. And I do wonder like by 2010 you can't really start a new Discord or a new SST records. And so like all of the money, you're not going to be a rock star and you're not going to be SST records. And so like you're in this funny in between space in relationship to commodification and in relationship to finance.
yeah. I think, a lot of the musicians I interviewed, I think some of them, I mean, they would take the high road. They would say, I don't want to sign with a major label because then I won't be able to write the music I want to write. But actually, I think a lot of people who said that weren't really super motivated to try to make a career.
Sure.
I'm not being critical of the Echo Park folks. I think, they understood how much work it would take, to build a career, and they enjoyed making music, the way they wanted to do it, and they could hang out with their friends, go to their friends' concerts, buy their friends' cassettes. So for them, the community aspect was one of the most important things, maybe the most important thing.
But I'm also thinking about when my question was motivated to a certain extent about by your discussion of classical music. So one of the things you kind of describe is this moment um, in the 19th century where you're just getting what Lawrence Levine calls kind of sacralization. This idea that kind of what we think of today when we think of classical music as this kind of like refined art form that not only doesn't have a place in like the hurly burly of the market, but shouldn't, that it's somehow above and apart from it. And you have this amazing study where you kind of talk about the ways in which the increased like Liszt is a star, right? Liszt
Yeah,
Liszt is making ladies faint in the front row. He's jumping on stage. He's like Jimi Hendrix,
yeah,
and kind of famously. And you kind of argue that like in fact, two things are happening simultaneously. One is he's making more money than musicians had made before. Bach is like trying to find a church gig and moving around, and like Liszt is like pulling in dough. But at the same time, he's pulling in dough partially because he's beginning to portray himself as this sacralized person outside of the marketplace. And that's
yeah,
possible because of the interposition of a new figure, which is the music manager that handles the business part of it so the musicians can like commune with the muses or whatever they do. And so kind of my take on that part is that what you're arguing is that actually pulling part of music out of the marketplace is what allows it to be kind of fully in the marketplace in a different way, and that you those it's a double move that has to function as a package in order to get something that starts to look by the end of the century like commodified music in the way we know. And so that the sacralized, the decommodified aspects of music are not ancillary but central to how the music industry functions in a Western context.
yeah. Well put. You make what I wrote sound better than it was, I think. I mean that's not how we talk about the 19th century very much in musicology, but and Marx isn't very helpful in talking about cultural commodities. I mean, when he talks about cultural commodities, it's not at very great length, and so there's not much there. There's plenty. There's plenty there that's theoretical. But when he says things like, the person who builds the piano
Yeah.
is a productive laborer, and the person who plays the piano isn't. I mean, even Raymond Williams said, we got to do better than that. I mean, it's a footnote in Marxism and literature. Um, and so I think musicology has yet to come to grips with a lot of the social transformations in which music was caught up in or even helped shape. And I think, one of those is about the commodification of artworks and especially music, because by the 19th century, you start having these impresarios who can fill a concert hall night after night after night. And even Marx would say, Anna Tsing talks about scalability, and that's what it is. I mean, once you can scale up, so that you have, a composer or performer playing for hundreds of people a night, you're out of the world of the composer or performer being a merchant, and you're into the world of capitalism. And what does all that mean for musicians? We we're getting more such studies, but there's still not that many.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things also that you talk about thinking about performances is there was really interesting discussion towards the end of the book about how performances function as commodities, and
Yeah.
it's complicated, right? Like, are they goods? Are they not goods? And like, what makes them happen exactly? Um, and I mean, one of the things that are really interesting that you kind of say is that you kind of have this language about realization, which I thought was really useful. I mean, you kind of say that one of the things, and this is from like kind of the practice theory part of your analytic framework, right? Is that you're like, when people talk about performances, they have this like awkward tendency to miss all of like the practice and work that happens before the performance. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit like why including that practice and that work is important, and how that helps us understand like what you think is happening when people perform.
Yeah, I mean, all musicians know this, not a joke, but this story about, like the restaurateur who says to musicians, "Hey, I'm opening a new restaurant and you can come and you get free exposure." And the musicians are like, "We should get paid, dude." Or come to my house and cook for free and you can get some exposure, you know. So there's an assumption by non-musicians to assume that, musicians just show up and play, which is what it looks like. But in fact, there's endless amounts of rehearsal and argument and instrument repair and instrument acquisition, and maybe there's costumes and there's just endless stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So the actual performance is a kind of culmination or realization of all of that stuff behind the scenes, where a lot of value, I think I write about as being value is sort of put in escrow, but then it's through all these behind the scenes preparations. But then there's this moment, the socially agreed upon moment of a performance, and then that's where value can perhaps be exchanged. And I use hedgy language because there's always people who go to a concert and who are like, didn't move me at all or whatever. So then, for them, there's no value. But I mean, I wanted to try to talk about that because, not all music is a physical object in the form of a compact disc or a cassette or something, or music notation.
Or
And
bundle of bits on the internet.
yeah, yeah, it might not be something that's streamable. But that doesn't mean there's no value getting, created, revealed, exchanged. And I want to try to find a way to think about that.
I thought that's so useful because for me, there's something about the lack of linearity that rang really true. Like so again, thinking about Mauss, which for listeners is this wonderful book called The Gift that's trying to think about all of these societies in different times in history. It's very like turn of the 20th century where he's like, in this 150-page book, I'm going to talk about Native American tribes from the Northwest, and then also the ancient Greeks, and then also like and. But it's talking about thinking about gift exchange as a way that societies can organize themselves. Um,
Yeah.
and that there is this moment of again, this anthropological framework is useful. It's this moment where like it gets action, like it happens between people in a kind of ceremonial way that's different than other times, maybe. And I love that idea that like the practice, all of this work is put into escrow, and that if you never perform, like if all you do is practice with your buddies in a basement, you never it doesn't mean, or perhaps even, and this is where I'm thinking with David Arditi, who has a wonderful book about getting signed and like the ideology of getting signed. Is like I would argue even a band that never intends to play is practicing as if there's an imaginary performance on the other side of the hill, even if they never get there. um
Yeah.
and but
Yeah. Well, they're creating value for themselves, but not necessarily for others. But they're thinking about that.
right, they're they in the part of the value for themselves is yeah, is it's and so this idea of like the nonlinearity of it, that like it's this value is put in escrow, and then in this symbolically charged moment, a live performance happens. It's something different, and then a different kind of value exchange occurs. That's really useful to me. I think that's right.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I mean, I didn't have an ethnography my own ethnography to back this up, but two of the most important books in ethnomusicology by Anthony Seeger called Why Suya Sing and Stephen Feld's book Sound and Sentiment. Both of them talk about musical rituals where it's clear there's a clear sort of buildup. Then there's a moment when everybody understands, like, now it's on, now it's happening. And to me, that was super interesting. And, we know that from going to a concert in America or Europe or somewhere that, everybody knows when the moment begins, when the concert begins. Some musicians will play with that, try to fool you. But I thought it was really interesting that, even classic ethnographies are talking about that question, even if they're not framing it in terms of value theory.
So, I mean, one of the things I want to ask you about here is something that you don't do that much in the book, which is to think about. You talk about musicians a lot, but you I think you focus on like recorded music and how it's experienced a little bit less, which is fine. Like, there's only so much you can do in one book. But this
Yep.
part about the live performance did make me. I thought it was really useful. Again, it made me think about kind of the rapturously received, like Taylor Swift tours from this year, or more, which I find interesting for a bunch of reasons. But one of which is that it feels like to me like the meaning of touring has changed a little bit in recent years. And part of that I wonder about is, and I've been struggling for a language to describe that, part of that, I wonder, is whether there's because people are experiencing music online and they're experiencing music in different kinds of social settings than had previously existed, whether that ritualistic element of performance that makes this certain kind of value exchange real, like whether there's a little bit of escrow from the audience side, maybe that there's some sort of social element in the listening of music that in a more traditional, not traditional, but an older setting, like without superstar tours, where there's less fandom build up, they would have like discharged that static electricity earlier. But like there's this really intense build up, and so like the escrow account is through the roof. Maybe to put a final piece of that incredibly mixed metaphor.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't have much of an ethnography, but I think things have changed a lot. I mean, the displacement of the primary sort of commodity as a recording with the band going on tour. I mean, that's the main way they make money. Ticket sales and merch sales and everything. So I think that's been a big shift. But at the same time, a lot of musicians have gotten out of uh, live performing because they're getting older and touring is brutal, at least for a lot of people, and so they want to, write music for TV shows or movies. And I did for my working musicians book. I interviewed Trent Reznor, and I asked him. I said, so I should explain. My wife's the anthropologist. Her cousin is a music lawyer, so he got me to Trent Reznor. There's no way I could have gotten to him otherwise. Um, and he said he didn't complain about touring, but he said working with David Fincher. I can't remember the movie now, but David Fincher. He said it was the most rewarding creative experience of his life. So I think there's a synergy with working with other people, even if you're not on tour, but which is seemed to be what he wanted. But I also think there's a lot of pent up demand for sociality after the after the pandemic. I think there's less social listening. I mean, I was a classical music nerd, so I only listened to classical music when I was a kid. But
Yeah.
I had friends, who would or not and buy the latest whatever album and listen to it with other friends. I think I did, even when I was really little, I had a tiny little, a little portable record player. So I was probably listening to some popular music when I was really little. I think those days are gone. Everybody, or even, when I was growing up, when there was only three networks, this was in the 70s. I mean, when you would go to school the next day, everybody was talking about what they had watched the previous night because, most kids were watching the same show. So you had this sense of being part of this big audience, even if you're home alone. Now, if you're listening to something streaming Home Alone, there's probably other streamers listening at the same time, but you don't know, and you don't know, and you're not going to go to school the next day and say, "Hey, did you hear that?" So I think these new technologies have really diminished our sociality quite a bit. Starting, I would say this is something I teach, starting in the 80s with the Sony Walkman. Because even with the even transistor
Sure.
radios had
Yeah.
little earbuds, but people never wore them in public. It was seen as, antisocial. Um, but the retreat, thanks to the neoliberalism and people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, there was a retreat from the public or even the idea of the public. So it became socially acceptable to wear your headphones in public. And now people, I get on the bus to go to campus and everybody is off, cocooned in their own world. Or even in the break in class, it used to be that I would have to get people to stop talking so I could start class or continue class. And now it's all quiet. They're just looking at their phones. It's kind of spooky.
So maybe to just kind of wrap things up, I wanted to end with what I thought was another really like a profoundly useful kind of framing that you have. That's about music very much as sociability, which is the chapter on kind of trad sessions. And I thought it was really useful and kind of like a really great counterweight to a posture that I hadn't realized we assumed quite so much on this podcast, but I think that we do, which is again, is, as you were saying earlier, this idea of kind of capitalism as this kind of large scale overarching force. And that I think that the kind of analytic framework that you kind of derive from Bordeaux, where you're thinking about structures, but then you're also thinking about people's desires within those structures and what they're actually choosing to do and why they're choosing to do it from their perspective and bringing that what they're choosing to do from their perspective back in. It was really really useful, and you kind of go through this like not laundry list, but like this list of like reasons why people have said that folks play trad. It's identity, it's counter hegemonic, it's all this stuff. And then you go like, but actually if you ask them why they're doing it, it's none of those things. They're doing it for this totally different set of reasons, and those reasons are real
Yeah.
too.
No, I mean, I'm not an Irish music scholar, really. I've written about it a little bit. I mean, I'm just a player, but the conventional wisdom was always that it's about the, maintenance of social hierarchy. So better players, get deferred to more, and older players, which is nice as I get older, I guess. But the conventional wisdom was always about maintenance of hierarchy. It's like, well, that may be happening, but what the musicians value is the sociality of the session. And I think, so I'm arguing against this sort of functionalist interpretation, which is still, I mean, functionalism is still pretty strong in the music fields. And
And by functionalism for listeners, you mean like people are doing this for this social function, basically.
functionalism is an idea. I mean, we associate it mainly with Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist from the 19th, early 20th centuries. But it became the dominant theory for a long time. It still is in some respects. It's an idea that society is like an organism, and every organism performs a function that makes society hang together. Um, so, maintenance of social hierarchies, or, you know, um, kowtowing to the elders, whatever you could, is a functionalist kind of interpretation because
Mm-hmm.
it makes society hold together. Um, but it has nothing to do with what people themselves actually think. So, like I said, I mean, maybe social hierarchy is getting maintained through session behavior, but that's not what people care about it. So I think, we need to pay attention to that. And, my interest in value theory, I guess we're coming full circle, but my interest in value theory, it matches or maps well onto Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, um, who wanted us to get rid of this sort of scientized way of looking at the world and a functionalist way of looking at the world and focus on what's meaningful to people. And for me, value is another way of talking about meaning. It's less idealist than Gertz's way, and it allows in, economic, which he left out. Um, but you can see the economic forms of value just, another form of value. And it can also talk about how economic forms of value can be translated, to use Anna Tsing's language, into other forms of value. So for me, it's still the Gertzian kind of approach, but more from, classic value theory mixed with Bourdieusian practice theory, because I mean, David Graeber argues in his book about value that value is created by or revealed by action, which is what I already said. I didn't acknowledge Graeber then. So we need to pay attention to people's actions, and the best theory we have for that, as far as I'm concerned, is Bourdieu. He rejects Bourdieu, so he has a pretty thin discussion of action, I think, in his book, as much as I like it. But it was my wife who coined the term practice theory, so I learned a lot from her about that. But it was trying to bring value theory together with a theory of action, which is practice theory. That's really what that book is about theoretically.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, folks. Check out this book; it's really, really interesting, and I think it'll help change the way you think about kind of how music works, which is like sick.
Well, thank you, Sam. It's been a pleasure.